Welcome, everyone. Before we get started, you can tell that my voice is gone, but I promise that I normally sound angelic. We're gonna make it through this. We have a fantastic panel today, so thank you all for joining us. My name is Ekemini Riley, as you heard, and I'll be moderating this amazing group of esteemed panelists. But before they introduce themselves, I want to set up the framework here. We want to discuss the barriers to research and development progress in the rare, neglected, and unrecognized disease space. So we're broadening it out a little bit. And then highlight the ways that philanthropy can really engage to create a ground for lasting change. So the goal here is to use this time to create a shared learning space for all of us to inform our work. Sorry, guys, I promise we're gonna make it through this. So I'll turn it over. Ellen, we'll start with you. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Ellen Agler, and I'm the CEO of the END Fund. END is for ending. My name is Ellen Agler. I'm CEO of the END Fund. END is for ending neglected diseases, and we work on controlling or eliminating 5 neglected tropical diseases that affect 1.5 billion people. So not the rare disease, because they're quite common, but we often say they're not just neglected diseases, they're actually diseases of neglected people. And so diseases of most people who are suffering from extreme poverty, lack of access to water and sanitation, usually have one of the diseases that we focus on.
Awesome. Steve.
My name is Steve Miller. I'm with the Foundation to Cure Laryngitis of Last-Minute Sufferers. We have a lot of work left to do, unfortunately. So my day job that I get paid for, I'm a venture capital investor. I co-founded a venture capital firm in Chicago called Origin Ventures that invests in early stage technology companies. Then there's the full-time job I have to pay for, which is vice president of the Ream Foundation. My wife Diane and I started this foundation about 12 years ago, and for the first 11 or so years, we were focused mostly on a broad area of programs in improving access to and quality of education and healthcare, as well as arts and culture. And then a few years ago, our oldest daughter, Rachel, was diagnosed with a condition called misophonia, and we hadn't heard of it before. Most doctors hadn't heard of it before, and there isn't really a lot of work being done in it. And so we decided to shift most of the resources of our Ream Foundation into research into misophonia.
Thank you. Sasha.
My name is Sasha Ati. I am founder and executive director of PCOS Challenge, which is the National Polycystic Ovary Syndrome Association. I founded PCOS Challenge after my own diagnosis with the disorder and feeling somewhat dismissed and not having enough resources to manage the condition and the emotional fallout of having this disorder. And then upon doing research, I found out that there were millions and millions of other women and girls and others who are impacted by PCOS. Our mission is to raise awareness about the disorder and help patients with the condition find resources to combat the disorder, empower themselves to combat the disorder, and also provide evidence-based information.
Thanks. Tanya.
Hi, I'm Tanya Simoncelli, and I'm the Director of Science Policy for the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, or CZI, is a relatively new philanthropic organization that was founded by Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan following the birth of their first daughter, Max. We have a very broad set of goals to leverage a combination of our capacities in grant making and technology and policy and advocacy to create a better future for everyone. As part of my role, I'm leading a brand new initiative that we launched in June called the Rare as One Project that I'll talk about, I'm sure, on the panel, but the goal is really to enable a model for disease research where patients and patient communities are really the key drivers.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. So let's just dig in. What are the barriers to progress that you all see in your respective disease areas? Yeah, go right ahead.
Well, it's interesting because the whole field of neglected tropical diseases wasn't called the field of neglected tropical diseases more than about 13 years ago. And there was a group of 4 scientists working on diseases like schistosomiasis and onchocerciasis, hookworm, blinding trachoma, who, one, they said, like, nobody knows, no one can pronounce our diseases, there's no advocacy around them. How can we get more attention for these, sort of siloed issue areas that actually affect a lot of people? I mean, here in the United States, we had trachoma in the American South, and that was one of the reasons that the Rockefeller Foundation was started, was actually as the project to eliminate hookworm in the American South. It used to be that blinding trachoma, if you were tested for trachoma when you came over to Ellis Island, and if you had trachoma, often you were not allowed into the country. So these are diseases that mostly have been solved by access to water and sanitation, access to more education, hygiene, and also just development. I think having shoes and paved roads and has really helped. But over time there's medicines that are now available to treat them, not completely eradicate the diseases. And some people might know the story of Merck donating ivermectin. That donation program started 30 years ago for river blindness. But now Pfizer donates Zithromax for trachoma, Johnson & Johnson, albendazole. So really this, over the years, increasing access to medicines, and a lot of them outright donated medicines for the population that's at risk. And so when I joined this field about 8 years ago, it was amazing to see, like, wow, there's about $4 billion of donated medicines per year. There is a channel to distribute them that is not uncomplicated, because it's through community health workers, community drug distributors, teachers. And if 1.5 billion people need access to treatment, that is a massive mobilization. And what's been quite exciting is partly putting the umbrella neglected tropical diseases as a bit of a marketing angle, and then the World Health Organization set up an NTD department. Philanthropists got more interested, there was more attention. It went from a smaller number of people having access to treatment to, over the last 3 years, as a global community, we've been able to provide treatment to over 1 billion people with one of the 5 diseases that we work on. Some of them have more than one, so it's not everybody having full access that's needed. And I always say, even though 1 billion is the most incredible global health story, it still means 500 million people aren't getting the treatment that they need. So I think there's still, even though there's increased awareness and attention, it's still not at the level of need. And often I think of neglected tropical diseases causing significant disability, but they're not always the big killers. Although schistosomiasis kills about 200,000 people per year, so after malaria, it is the second biggest parasitic killer. And so I think that there's a focus sometimes on diseases that cause early mortality. Like, how can we just focusing on surviving, but not necessarily on thriving? And I think that diseases that cause disability or malnutrition, stunted growth, sometimes don't get as much attention. So yeah, I'd say the barriers are still around access to care, around delivery, and still a huge funding gap. There has been significant bilateral investment and some private philanthropic investment, but not to the level of need really to address the problem.
Any of you else want to jump in? Go right ahead.
Sure. So I'm going to illustrate I think the biggest barrier in misophonia by asking the audience a question. Who here has heard of misophonia? 1, 2, 3, about 7.
This is probably more than
my
your
wife
average
doesn't
audience.
count. Right. So one of the biggest barriers, really a fundamental barrier to all of this, is awareness. Most people aren't aware of misophonia. It actually isn't even in the DSM. It's not diagnosable yet. I'll define it a little bit for you. It's Latin for hatred of sound, misophonia, misophonia. People who suffer from it are triggered by certain common sounds. Some of those triggers include other people chewing, or other people tapping their fingers, or clicking a pen, or clearing their throat. Some other people are triggered by the sounds of certain other people's voices when they speak. And what happens when a person with misophonia is triggered is the amygdala in their brain goes into fight or flight mode, and the person has a serious rage response. They want to punch somebody or hurt somebody or hit a wall because they've heard this sound, which is a common sound that most everybody else wouldn't even notice, let alone be triggered by. So it's a difficult problem because it isn't just an audiological problem. There's neuroscience involved, there's psychology involved, and A lot of people in the medical community haven't ever heard of this. We got lucky because one of the doctors who treats our daughter had heard of it. He couldn't do anything about it. There is no treatment or cure for it. And so not a lot of funding for it, not a lot of research done, not a lot of awareness. We think that it's much more prevalent than it appears to be, because people who do suffer from it don't know what to call it, or their parents don't know what to call it, and so they're just a problem child who yells every time they hear a sound that disturbs them, and so they must just be a teenage jerk or something, but when seriously they really have a problem. So the lack of awareness is one of the significant barriers, and then that leads to everything else in terms of funding needs and the need for care in the community and all that.
I would like to just first explain what PCOS is. PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome, is the most common hormone disorder in women. It's one of the most common human disorders, yet it used to be listed as a rare disease. Once we learned more about PCOS and its impact on a woman throughout her lifespan, we now know that it's not just a reproductive disorder. We now know that women with PCOS, 50% will become diabetic or pre-diabetic before age 40. This is according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And PCOS is also the most common cause of infertility in women. It's connected to some of the largest burdens on health and healthcare, yet most people have never heard of it. There's a huge awareness issue around PCOS. And some of that stems from the lens through which we historically viewed PCOS, which was through the reproductive lens, this is a condition of the ovaries, but it's so much more than that. It's a metabolic and endocrine disorder that impacts multiple organ systems. And hence this led to issues around funding PCOS, funding research for PCOS. And PCOS, we'll use the NIH, the largest funder of biomedical research, as an example, funds less than 0.1%, of NIH's budget goes to PCOS research, even though the prevalence is up to 20% of women, and the impact on quality of life is tremendous. It's huge. And it's also connected to diabetes, heart disease, cancer, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, all these diseases that are some of the leading causes of death in women. So this is there's an opportunity here, but the barrier to making progress in PCOS is just the lack of funding for research, caused by the lack of awareness and the lack of support in the community. So women and girls with PCOS are suffering in silence. Some of the symptoms of PCOS include excess facial and body hair in women. And if you have a teenage daughter who is struggling with mood disorders, with her periods being irregular, with having facial hair, with having weight gain, that's a really tough thing to live through as a young girl. So we've found that many of these girls are dropping out of school, are having to be homeschooled. One of our members, Karen, she's 15, she got a grant from our organization for the treatment of facial hair because she dropped out of school, had suicidal thoughts because she was being bullied so badly for something that was beyond her control. So the awareness issue stems from many PCOS patients living in silence, not speaking up, and the lack of education across the board for providers, for patients. And yeah, this is definitely a barrier that we're trying to address and change.
Tanya.
Yeah, so to build off what was just said about awareness, someone said the other day to me, people go to medical school for 1,200 days, but there are 7,000 rare diseases. So how could you possibly learn in medical school about, how could you possibly know when someone comes in to you to see you about and has a rare disease, how would you possibly know how to treat it? So while each individual rare disease is very rare, as a class, it's actually common to have a rare disease, and there are actually 400 million people around the world with a rare disease. So the rarity of each individual disease poses a whole bunch of challenges to study these diseases, especially in the context of the health research ecosystem that we are unfortunately living with right now. One that doesn't really allow for very easy data sharing and is way too siloed. So if you're a researcher at an academic research, a medical academic research center, and you want to study a rare disease, it's enormously challenging because the chances that you're going to have enough patients come into your office to actually create a meaningful sized cohort to study is very, very low. So you actually have to go out and find enough patients, and you have to consent them. And they're probably going to be patients all over the world, especially if it's an ultra-rare disease. And you have to consent them, and you have to collect their data and their specimens, and you probably want to meet them.
Yeah.
You probably want to know what their insights are to this disease, right? And so it's enormously time-consuming. You either need to do that, or you need to find other researchers at academic research institutions that might have come across some of these patients as well who are willing to share data and specimens. But the incentives to do that are pretty low. Also because that takes time, and you have to figure out if the patients were adequately consented, et cetera, et cetera. So there are enormous challenges. I think what is inspiring to me is that it's the patient communities that are actually recognizing that they're not going to wait for the system to catch up. And they are actually the ones, the stakeholders that are most poised to address some of these barriers. And I think that's why, at CZI, we've launched an initiative that's really about looking at how we can lift up patient communities and build support into communities to help them actually be drivers of research and actually organize their own research enabling infrastructure to attract researchers to their disease areas and to actually overcome those barriers of being small patient populations.
Right, so then let's get to the crux of it here. Philanthropy. How can philanthropy engage in this area? And Tanya, we'll start with you because you're out of philanthropy. So
Yeah.
What's your perspective here?
So I think what philanthropy can do really well is to catalyze new approaches when the traditional approaches to solving problems isn't working. So what we're doing at CZI in this space is the program that we launched in June. It's brand new, so we still have a lot to learn. Is called the Rare as One Project, and what we're working to do is to really build a virtual incubator to support rare disease communities through a combination of developing tools and identifying tools that they can use to build and strengthen their communities, to reach out to researchers to get up to speed on the state of the science so that they can be active participants and actually drivers of research, that they can truly partner with researchers and clinicians and incentivize research in their space so that they can do things like pull together the data and specimens that are needed to study their disease, and that they can create centralized spaces so that data sharing then isn't the problem, institutional level data sharing. So we've seen this model to be enormously effective, but not all patient communities have the resources to do this. They need coaching and they need support. So we're looking at ways we can combine. CZI is a fairly unique institution in that we look for, first of all, we look for the solutions to problems in the communities we're aiming to serve, because we believe it's actually the affected communities that have the best solutions. So this is where we're going straight to the patient communities and looking at different models of how patient communities have actually become active drivers in research and how we can replicate and scale those models. So we're doing that, and then we looked at places where we can combine our unique sort of capacities in not just grant making, but also technology and tool building and capacity building and policy and advocacy type capacity building and movement capacity building. And so we're looking to sort of integrate these different capacities and design, training programs to help support patient communities get up to speed on the state of the science and engage directly with researchers and clinicians, and bring together, really build like patient-led collaborative research networks in their disease areas, and help actually drive the formation of research agendas for these rare diseases. We can't afford lack of efficiency when you're trying to solve a rare disease. And so, the patients can really, by being at the table, can really help drive an effective strategies.
Steve, you're a philanthropist yourself. How are you engaging now through the Ream Foundation?
So that's a tough act to follow. But as somebody who is a venture capital investor, we go at this in sort of a venture philanthropy kind of approach. I'm used to working with startups that don't have a lot of resources, that have sort of a green field in front of them. And so we're kind of taking that approach with misophonia. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. First of all, there isn't a standardized diagnostic tool yet, and so that's something that has to be developed. In addition to trying to come up with treatments and trying to do basic science to understand what causes this and what treatments there might be. So we did a smart thing. It was probably my wife's idea, and this also was I wasn't asked to make this plug, but we hired the Milken Institute Center for Strategic Philanthropy. Aren't you involved in that? Yeah. Right. Yes. I'm pretty sure, in addition to being the token male on the panel, that's why I'm here. But no, it was really it was a very, very smart thing, because as you heard when I introduced myself, we haven't done a lot of work. We haven't done any work really in funding medical research, and so we don't know the first place to start to do that, especially how to do it effectively and impactfully, because you can throw a lot of money up against the wall and it'll all fall down and you're not going to make any progress. I mean, that's easy to do, especially in medical and scientific research. And so we knew that we needed help with that. And thankfully, the Center for Strategic Philanthropy has a consulting practice that does exactly that, helps philanthropists who want to make impact funding scientific and medical research to come up with a plan to do that. And so the Center for Strategic Philanthropy, I will get it out the first time, one of these times, actually did a whole study of all the work that's been done in misophonia. They talked to people in London and in Amsterdam and all over the US. Who's done work in this? They asked them, who else should we talk to? They convened a symposium in Chicago, where we live, where 30 scientists from around the world came together. For the first time, these people are coming together to talk about misophonia. There's audiologists who they attend audiology conventions, but they never talk about misophonia. There's neuroscientists who, same thing with neuroscience conventions. But this was a misophonia symposium. And we were able to convene that because we're putting resources behind it. And so fast forward, the Center for Strategic Philanthropy, I think I got it right the first time, has put together a Giving Smarter guide. It's a 45 some odd page document that's available online, which is a strategic plan for how best to leverage philanthropy to make an impact in misophonia research. And we've started to execute on that plan just a month or so ago. We've made our first grants. We put out a request for proposals 5-6 months ago, got 40 some odd proposals from around the world. And interestingly, several of them were from scientists who had not previously done work in misophonia, and that was great. We really, that we want new, bright minds looking at a big problem. And we made our first round of grants just a month or so ago, so it's exciting.
Awesome. Ellen, Sasha, perspectives here on how philanthropy can engage.
Sure. Well, we've found philanthropies can move the field of PCOS research by 10 to 20 years. I think the field is ready. Our organization, PCOS Challenge, has built a community of 50,000 plus members, and these are patients who are ready and willing and want to participate and design research studies that benefit them, and that design research studies based on our priorities, right? I think that, to your point, this is the way to move forward, is to include patients at the table in all aspects of research design, from design throughout the entire process. And but I think the field is ready for investment. And we've also partnered with some of the leading researchers in the field of PCOS. And I surveyed a few of them yesterday asking, what would you do with an investment in PCOS research? And some of the underlying things are, we need long-term, multi-center studies, large studies, to be funded outside of the field of reproduction, right? Into mental health, into metabolic health, understanding the full scope of PCOS, and also addressing some of the comorbidities such as diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and cancer. Why PCOS is leading to some of these, and how can we use PCOS as a case to prevent some of these disorders. I think also advocacy. We've done advocacy work on Capitol Hill, and we, in partnership with patients, in partnership with researchers and medical societies, and now have over 130 members of Congress who understand that the seriousness of PCOS, and also support the need for more research, education, and support for the community. So I think philanthropy can really help to advance this field by 10 years. And without philanthropy, because of the lack of funding for patient organizations like PCOS, because of the lack of funding for PCOS research, I think that's stifling progress. And philanthropy is absolutely the way forward.
Ellen.
I just feel so happy right now. I'm like so blessed to be on the panel with this group, because I think that so many things that were said is like exactly what philanthropy can do. And I feel so appreciative that, CZI is taking on something that really is underrepresented in the world of philanthropy. There's not that many people looking at rare diseases. And also to start with the fact of we cannot afford to not be efficient. And philanthropy can be an amazing convener. Philanthropy, if they listen to patient perspectives. Philanthropy, I so appreciate you saying this, is like start with I don't know. And I think I've worked 25 years with thousands of philanthropists, and I can tell you that not all of them come with I don't know first. They come with I know, because I was successful in this other area of my life. I'm going to be successful in this new area. And so approaching things with humility, I think is just another key component. And I can share a little bit of the story about how the End Fund is just one example of so many.
Yes.
But it really started with philanthropists, which is interesting because sometimes organizations are started because a person is affected by the disease or they're an expert in it. And this really was started by venture capital individuals, people from that were investing their own capital, both in markets, but then also trying to get the greatest return on their dollar from the philanthropic perspective, and actually had no interest or background in neglected tropical diseases. And they read this one particular group, Legatum, out of Dubai. Some of the partners read an article in the Financial Times saying, okay, for as little as 50 cents per person per year, you can deliver treatments against these 5 diseases. And their thought was, well, that's either too good to be true or too good to pass up. Let's pick up the phone, which I find like venture guys do this a lot. They read something and they don't just turn the page. It's like, I'm going to call that person quoted in this article. And what is this about? And thought, okay, when they realized this is a great opportunity, and the integration of treatment was happening across the 5 diseases just at that time. Maybe we can help create a case study. Let's see if this works. Got really excited when they saw in a couple of countries the disease prevalence going down. and originally thought, well, maybe we can help move our philanthropic capital to address this, across a larger geography. And when they realized, okay, actually, there's more partners, more players, and more funding needed than we can do ourselves, why don't we do what we would do in the venture world, which is create a fund and engage a whole community of investors, and not just support one organization, but support a whole portfolio of organizations addressing this cause in a coordinated way. And so that was sort of the vision that has turned out. There's kind of a couple, tests and fail along the way, but over time, the idea has been like, how can the organization look at things through a systems lens? So who's doing what where are the gaps, where can you make sure that you're complementary, and actually realize that coordination takes an exceptional amount of time to do it well. That's part of strategic philanthropy, is like really take the time to make sure you know who's doing what where so that you don't overlap. And the idea of the End Fund was that if you're going to work with the Ministry of Health, try to come as the End Fund that represents now hundreds of philanthropists that are investing, rather than setting up a structure where dozens of philanthropists are going to show up at the door of a country trying to coordinate and do their own thing. And I remember in the early days, when I used to work for Operation Smile, so a whole other set, worked actually a lot on craniofacial disfigurements, that some of them extremely rare. And somebody told me, like, philanthropy just causes problems. We don't need philanthropy in this space. Philanthropy, why did you leave a great job for something we know you're going to fail at? And I thought, oh my God, there's really some bad experiences with philanthropy in the community. And by really partnering with like the government, the World Bank, which a lot of times philanthropy doesn't do, to make sure that what was done was complementary, I think really has allowed for first trust, and I think also starting with the sense of how can we be of best and highest service to the broader sector, even if it means changing our strategic plan around the way. Because one of the things I've heard is like, philanthropy sometimes can be more flexible, can be the risk capital, has a higher appetite to fail than some other sources of funds. And so to make sure we keep that. And some of our investors will be like, the portfolio is too successful. I don't think that means we're taking enough risk. Like, should we really build in that we have enough of a risk appetite that we're willing to fail? And a lot of times people say that, but that doesn't actually end up being true. So yeah, I think, and over the course of 8 years, we've been able to mobilize now over $200 million toward these 5 diseases. That's not nearly enough for what is needed, but it's still a significant amount that we, in coordination with others, are able to have an outsized impact. So yeah, I'd say those things of coordination, humility, and thinking about what is the system within your working. So it's great that you engaged Milken to help
before we
with that.
open it up to the audience, sorry guys, I'm going to talk about the toolkit for success. I'm hearing patience coming to the table. I'm hearing humility. Is there anything else you want to interject here before we open it up?
Yeah, well, for us, and I can speak for our field, the toolkit is investing in the patient. So what that looks like, what success looks like, and that is funding support for patients. Patients really do need support, and from support organizations like myself. We weren't funded by grants, so everything we do, we have to fundraise to put on a symposium that we do annually. These are some of the barriers to really having the impact that we need. So support for awareness, education is extremely important. Also, research. Without research, the field cannot progress. We cannot, and I think engaging patients on targeted treatments, that's done through patient-focused drug development and other types of those systems that engage patients, and along with the research community and along with the provider community, I think is what a successful toolkit looks like.
Right.
Um, I guess just building off something that Steve said, and I had to laugh, Steve, when you said hard act to follow, because then you went on to describe how you're doing exactly the model that we're like now trying to figure out how to replicate for other groups. And it was amazing actually to listen to what you described. And I think you pointed out that there's this challenge of not knowing what to fund, right? And all the patient groups that, if you're interested in this patient-driven research approach, I think one of the biggest challenges for the groups is they have to learn the state of the science and the disease to make smart decisions. So they'll do GoFundMe pages, and they'll raise money, and they'll raise $50,000 here or whatever, even $1 million, and then they'll say, well, what do we do with it? And if the patients haven't taken the steps to build a community and not just talk to like one researcher that they know is interested in their disease, but actually really take the time to develop a network of researchers and clinicians and get that network to actually work together and together to develop a unified research agenda and a shared list of priorities for not what research that one researcher wants to do or is interested in, but what is the path to solve this disease? And that's what the patient communities can do. They can galvanize the creation of these shared strategies. And that's what every rare disease needs. That's what every disease needs. Right. But in rare disease, you have to have that, right? And so I think giving them the tools to engage across the ecosystem and to kind of to actually leverage what they have, which is they can raise money for researchers. They are the advocates. They are the power in the community, and to leverage that power to actually bring the community together and unify the community and develop a strategy for the disease is actually we think that is sort of one of the key things that we're trying to figure out, and we don't know. Back to the humility question, we don't know exactly how to do it and whether it will work for every rare disease, but we think there's enough commonality across the challenges that these communities are facing that we can actually start to work with them to develop what are the tools, what are the trainings, what are the programs we could, we're looking into creating a science advising program, for example, to help groups. They don't need a full-time CSO, but they need kind of a part-time science advisor to help them review the literature and where are the gaps and what could we fund to help start filling these gaps. So these are the kinds of things that we're looking and the kinds of things that we're putting into our toolkit.
Right. Is there anything else you guys want to add before we?
I'm happy to add. I'm so happy to hear that. I feel like when I first entered the neglected tropical disease space, there's lots of organizations working on it, and even when you would look at different websites and different material coming out, they all had different statistics and different advocacy messages, and then if people wanted to go and try to get something on the World Health Assembly agenda, it would be like this sort of herd of organizations all going together in a disorganized way. And there was a really, an insight by the community of we are going to be stronger together. And what does that look like? And honestly, first it had to be people being we have to set our egos and logos aside. We actually can't work under our own logos. And we created the Uniting to Combat NTDs, which is just a sort of a virtual organization, but now that sort of has hundreds of signatories and we've funded a small secretariat, and that secretariat is the one that okay, if you're gonna go speak to a broader community like the African Union for us or WHO, it cannot be under this banner of a lot of noise that is hard to cut through. Yeah. So I think that clarity of message and singularity of purpose that really, and if you scratch the surface of it, people are actually committed to that versus okay, that's a veneer for actually a really dysfunctional community. And it's really been great to see that over time because it's hard actually, especially in a banner that is multiple diseases. Because actually neglected tropical diseases, and some people are well, we're the neglected of the neglected tropical, or we're the we want to be added. We want another disease, And so WHO is no more neglected tropical diseases. We're already we have unfunded mandates of too many diseases under this banner. So there are issues, but I think when it comes to really clear needs for advocacy, that the community has figured out a way to rally around. So it's not always an easy path to get there, but it's great that's part of the toolkit you're supporting.
Awesome. So we'll start with you and then we'll go to the back.
Thank you guys. Question, I've been helping a client of mine who's started a foundation for her daughter who has a very, very neurodevelopmental disorder. And actually, she did, thank you. She did actually what you said, and she first found 350 other families who had the same exact genetic marker. And the question I have for you is, she's at a point, and she's been coordinating research like you mentioned, where she is wondering whether she should consider turning this into a for-profit activity, not because she has personal financial goals out of it, but she is wondering if it will give more credibility and get taken more seriously as she attempts to fundraise and build out the science. And so I'd be interested if you guys have an opinion, if that's in fact not necessary in philanthropy and so forth would be enough.
Yeah, so this is something we're just starting to look at, this question of kind of the venture philanthropy type model of, groups actually taking a more approach where they can then recoup from, say, sales of samples or something like that, or collaborations with industry and so forth. We're very focused I don't know the answer as whether that's the right path and I wouldn't want to even try to advise. I think we've seen some really, if you look at like the CF Foundation and some of these other strategies that groups then have been very successful with, there's no question that can be a very successful approach. I think it sort of depends. Part of me thinks that the answer is it depends on what stage the group is in. I feel like when a group is starting out, it's hard to sort of jump into that model because the first thing you really have to gain the trust of the community, the full patient community, and the trust of the research community. It also depends what stage of research things are in. If you're still in a very basic stage of research where you don't even understand the underlying biology of the disease, you're not even really ready for that kind of model necessarily. So I don't know. But I think there are some really creative and interesting models emerging. I mean, Steve actually might be the best person to answer that question.
Yeah, I do want to clarify based on something you just said earlier about venture philanthropy, because I used that term a few minutes ago. We're not, this is completely philanthropic. We're not investing in researchers and then we're going to recoup profit. It is, so when I say venture philanthropy, I refer to that as sort of the approach of a venture capitalist looking at a whole bunch of pitches basically and picking out the best teams to fund that's and then trying to help them with their strategies of cooperating with each other and building something. So that's what I mean when I say venture philanthropy. Whatever works. Frankly, I would look at it as an investment. If there's profit to be made, then chances are, if there's a return, then there will be investors out there. If there's a pathway to that, and if there are investors who have an appetite for that, then why not? I'd be the last person up here to say, people shouldn't start something for profit. Why would they do that? I don't know that this. Obviously, I know nothing about the specific disease condition that you're talking about. How big is the market? How prevalent is this thing? Is there an opportunity to make a significant return? And if so, then chances are there are investors out there who would potentially fund it.
Awesome. Next question.
Great discussion so far. My name is Marshall Summer. I chair the Rare Disease Institute at the Children's Hospital here, and I also had the privilege of being NORD's board chairman as well. One of the dilemmas I've seen in rare disease is we have thousands, and we're probably going to peak out around 12,000 different diseases plus, all different, all unique. Yet we also have common structures that we need across these disease and disease groups. One of the things we find is that when we have new, really enthusiastic, ready-to-go groups, they always bring something new to the table, but we also reinvent the wheel a lot. And given that we don't have enough philanthropic dollars to cover 12,000 diseases to depth, how do we avoid that repetition, but at the same time get these new ideas in? I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Great question.
Well, so part of our theory behind the Rare as One initiative is that we should start sort of backing up and sort of trying to think about this as more broadly as one community and not as 7,000 or 12,000 or somewhere in between. And really start to understand what are the commonalities across, not so much the diseases scientifically. They're all going to have their own scientific challenges, although that is a different question. There's a whole bunch that are probably more related to common diseases or more related to one another, and because of our the taxonomy of diseases that we're living with, we're not actually seeing those connections, and that's another big challenge. But in terms of the commonalities, we want to make it so that The only thing that's standing in between where we are today with the state of the science in a disease and a treatment or cure for tomorrow is the science, right? And there are all these other things standing in the way. Collecting enough samples to study the disease, getting the patient communities together, like bolstering those communities to be advocates for progress against their disease. These are all enormously important, and they're not actually about the science per se. They're about they're about their social issues and their business model issues and their structural issues. And so I think that's where there's enormous continuity and commonality across all of these diseases. And if we can start tackling those challenges, then it's just a matter of the science. And I don't mean to say that lightly, because some of these diseases are going to be a lot harder to solve than others. But if that's the only thing that we have to focus on, and now we have all these patient communities well organized so that it's a lot easier to study the diseases, then I think that we have a chance of really making progress.
If only there were some sort of tool that these communities could use to network socially online. Look into that.
Well, that has, social media, and it's not just Facebook, by the way. There are a lot of actually Rare Connect. There's a bunch of them. Has created an opportunity for groups to organize themselves in unparalleled, ways, and that is partly why we're seeing a shift in the rare disease space, where the communities are actually taking the reins and recognizing that they can actually help drive progress in new ways, because they can now connect with one another around the world. So it's, in seriousness, that is but we are independent from Facebook.
I know. I just had to get that in.
Hi, I'm Megan Golden. I'm co-founder of Mission Cure, and we are working to cure pancreatitis, which is inflammation of the pancreas, a devastating disease with no treatment at all. And we've been around for just 2 years now, and one of the things we've seen is that the incentive system is broken, that we have at one side doing the early research, the academic researchers who have very long timelines and they're incentivized by publication. And there's the valley of death, and then at the other end are the pharma companies and the investors who are incentivized by profit. And as a result of that, the disease foundations are really the ones who are kind of incentivized by patient outcomes. But because of this system, things that might benefit patients but not produce a profit get overlooked, like repurposing of already approved drugs and generic drugs. And there are, the cures to a lot of these diseases might already be sitting in our medicine cabinet, and they don't cost very much to put into clinical trials or to get approved, and we know they're safe. It just doesn't happen because of the incentive system. So my background is in social impact bonds, pay for success financing, and we're trying to use some kind of outcome-based financing incentives, but I'm curious from the panel, how have you addressed this incentive issue, and are any of you looking at repurposing of generic or already approved drugs?
So, we aren't yet, to answer the latter question. I am aware that there are folks within the misophonia community who have ostensibly had some success with off-label uses of previously approved medications that were approved for other uses. There's not a lot of, the N isn't very big in terms of provability there yet, but that would be my only answer to it.
Just my thought coming from the patient community is that does not have a drug for PCOS. Actually, PCOS is one of the most common off-label use for metformin, the diabetic drug. And the recent guideline named oral contraceptives as the first-line therapy for PCOS. I think, however, that's not enough. It's not effective in treating everyone with PCOS. Oral contraceptives, as an example, can be contraindicated in some cases. With women with PCOS, are already hypertensive and at risk for, but the most commonly prescribed drug is also the first line therapy, is also potentially what's being used most commonly for PCOS. We, as a patient organization, I think have this role in asking for better therapies and participating in better therapies and being respected, our voices being respected at the table. So yeah, I completely agree with you. Yeah.
Next question. Yes.
Along the same lines of your question, having to do with sort of the drug development process and the valley of death. My name is Caroline. I come from the University of North Carolina, Corporate Foundation Relations. But we have a catalyst for rare disease, and we have been toying with the idea of an open science approach. And it's kind of controversial even in a university academic setting, because the way academic institutions work is still there's a tech transfer office, and once you get something, regardless of whether it's in drug development, but once you get something that's commercializable, the university wants you to have IP around that because that's what gives you the value. But we recognize that that stunts the ability to move more quickly, especially in rare disease where maybe those business models don't work as well. And so we're very interested and curious about your opinions about utilizing an open drug discovery model, open science. And then additionally, there's a connection maybe to personalized medicine, because the regulatory pathway could be one that would be figured out for rare disease, but then could be applied to more commercially viable rare disease kind of markets.
Positions on open science.
So CZI has a very strong we have a whole program focused on open science, and that might be of interest to you to look at some of the things that we're doing. Again, brand new program. So I don't know that we have an answer as to whether the entire drug development pipeline could be open. I do know some organizations actually trying to demonstrate this, and you're probably familiar with some of them as well, and trying to work on this and kind of do a proof of concept almost. So I'm fascinated with this. In my previous life, I actually worked at the ACLU and launched a lawsuit challenging the patenting of human genes that went to the Supreme Court, the Myriad case. And so I've been a real proponent of open science and figuring out spaces where that is, where the sort of combination of IP practices and principles and the law are actually stifling innovation, and that was a place where I felt like the genome should be open and free to use. I think it obviously gets more complicated the more applied. As we get away from the things that should so obviously to every single scientist be open and be part of a scientific commons, to things where there's true discovery, and how you balance those things, I think is really, it comes down to almost a case-by-case basis from what I've looked at, but I think it's really complicated. But I'd love to learn more about how you're thinking about it.
Okay, we'll end off with our last question. Yes.
While we're doing that question, I wanted to address as well. I've really enjoyed seeing the role that philanthropists have played in sort of forcing open science, and even we work a lot with the Gates Foundation. They sort of came out with even if you do research, you can't publish it in a place unless it can be accessible to everybody. And there's all these sort of subscription firewalls, just literally accessibility so that anybody in the world. And it made a huge difference, especially when a lot of our work is with medical practitioners and scientists in developing countries who just can't afford. So what are those barriers that can be reduced, I think is quite exciting. Also, in the case of neglected tropical diseases, a number of big pharma came together and said, okay, we're going to open our compound libraries to each other if the research is for this subset of diseases, which did make a difference in some cases. So I don't know if that's also happening for rare diseases, but there's certainly precedent there for neglected diseases.
Awesome. Yes.
I'm Jing Lu from the University of Michigan Data Science Institute. So 2 questions. One is, from a researcher's point of view, how do you guys think that what is a good mechanism to to promote the study of rare diseases among researchers, especially given the sort of a prototypical funding model where, you know, the researcher has to study something that has the potential of continued funding in the next 10 or 20 or 30 years, right? So that's one question. The second question is, how do you guys view rare diseases actually in the context of precision medicine or precision health? Because, you know, once you study the individual factors behind, you know, a common disease, like for, let's say, you know, breast cancer, but, you know, if you go into the specific cell types, there might be, you know, 100 different types of, you know, breast cancer, right? So in a sense, a lot of the diseases that we think are not rare will be broken into many rare types. So how do you make the connection there?
So I completely agree. So to your second point, I talk about this a lot, that eventually pretty much every disease will be a rare disease. And so we better get the model right. We better figure out multiple approaches and models that can work to drive progress against these diseases, because it's going to become ever more complex, and the patient communities are going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. So we either need to solve this. I think there's two ways we need to solve it. It's the way that I've been describing, that we're trying to approach this at CZI, which is empowering the patient communities, which I think to your question also is really part of the answer to aligning those incentives. It's the patients that are at the center of all of those other stakeholders and players. But the other way we have to do it is more at the institutional level. We need, we need a healthcare ecosystem that's much more of a learning health system. And I think that's going to be a long haul. So right now my bet's on the patients. And I think you end up getting better outcomes and better research when patients are involved. I truly believe, and I've seen so many examples of this. But I think we have to solve the problem at both ends, because every disease will become a rare disease, and we're going to have a system where data sharing and specimen sharing and all of this stuff is just a lot easier to do, or we're not going to be able to tackle these things in an efficient way.
Great.
Okay, thank you all for hanging in with my lack of voice.
Good job.
Thank you.